Then the procession reformed and passed out to the graveyard, through paths lined with yet more white and purple flowers, to the solemn organ notes of Chopin's funeral march. The final hymn, "Now the labourer's task is o'er," was sung as the coffin was lowered into the moss-lined grave and the bishop pronounced a blessing. The coffin bore the simple inscription, "Alexander Macmillan, born October 3rd, 1818, died January 25th, 1896. He was laid to rest close to the grave of his 10-year-old grandson Alistair, who had died of peritonitis just 4 years earlier. Yet for many of the mourners there was a darker shadow in the graveyard and a missing tomb. Alexander's eldest, unhappy and unconventional son Malcolm had last been seen on a mountainside in Turkey some 8 years earlier, and no one knew where he lay buried or if he was even dead. The only certainty was that Alexander had never recovered from this loss. The funeral party consisted of some 80 or 90 people, family and friends, including 30 or more representatives of the Macmillan Publishing House in Bedford Street. Notable among the group of mourners were some of the heavyweight intellectuals of the day. John Morley, the last of the great late 19th century liberals. Henry James, already a well-known and highly successful author. Professor Norman Lockyer, founding editor of the journal Nature. Sir George Grove, first director of the Royal College of Music. And Sir Henry Roscoe, a chemist and vice-chancellor of the University of London. Around the grave stood the headmasters of Harrow and Westminster schools, honouring a man whose own schooling had finished at the age of 15. Some of the deceased's greatest friends were missing. At the age of 77, Alexander Macmillan had outlived many of the men who had shaped his life or helped him make his fortune. His heroes, Frederick Denison Morris, Charles Kingsley, Thomas Huxley, Matthew Arnold, and Alfred Lord Tennyson, were gone, and Tom Hughes, too frail to attend, would follow Macmillan into the grave 2 months later, the man known as Lewis Carroll 2 years after that. Chief among the long-departed was Alexander's brother Daniel, his earliest partner in the founding of the firm, who had been dead nearly 40 years. In his final decade, Alexander would still ask, in a puzzled tone, "What would Daniel think of this?" The funeral marked the passing of a man born in absolute poverty, with only the most rudimentary education, yet it celebrated a life of considerable achievement. Alexander's father had died in his early 50s, worn out by the toils of scraping a living amidst the harsh conditions of a small croft on the west coast of Scotland. He left his 8 surviving children, including the 2 youngest boys, 10-year-old Daniel and 5-year-old Alexander, to make their way in the world with nothing to shape their lives except the moral precepts that were drummed into them by their mother, and the understanding that work was hard, even painful, but necessary. These boys rise through apprenticeships and wretched servitude, as they described it, to become masters of their own business, was not unprecedented in the Victorian age. This was the era of Samuel Smiles's self-help handbooks. What makes their story so compelling and unusual is the humour and noble-heartedness of all their endeavours. Daniel and Alexander Macmillan were proud to call themselves Christian socialists, being active philanthropists and loving family men, and between them they founded not just one of the great publishing houses of the Western world, but a dynasty that within 2 generations would leap across class boundaries to marry into the nobility and produce a British Prime Minister. Alexander Macmillan once described himself as an advocate for the ignorant. Perhaps this phrase has lost its meaning over the last century. Today we think of ignorance as a personal failing, a deliberate decision by an individual to avoid education, to turn one's back on the plethora of freely available sources of information and knowledge. To the philanthropic Victorians, however, it was seen as a want to be remedied, closer to hunger, thirst, or ill health, and signified a failing by society to nurture its members. To be ignorant was to be ignored. This was the cause that Alexander and his brother Daniel took to be their mission on earth.